Good evening, everyone. Happy fourth night of Hanukkah, Chag Orim Sameach, happy Festival of Lights. Hope you'll join me in the lighting of the menorah tonight, the Chanukiah, with our fourth candle. And in just a bit, sit back and enjoy what I think is a very special program this evening, welcoming Barbara Donick and Sheryl Reicher, talking about the topic of perseverance, the topic of resilience, and their memories, a sense of understanding from having family members who lived through the Shoah, lived through the Holocaust. So if you'll join me for the blessings. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Chanukah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asa nisim lavoteinu bayamim hahem b'azman hazeh. From my family to yours, from the Bethel family to yours, Chag Sameach, happy Hanukkah. I'm honored tonight to welcome Sheryl Reicher and Barbara Donick to sit with me for a few minutes and talk about our value of the evening, which is tonight the value of perseverance. I don't think it takes a lot of imagination. It's not a stretch by any means to understand how perseverance plays into the Hanukkah story. The Maccabees lived through one of the darkest times in Jewish history, and through grit and determination, and certainly that value of perseverance, they were able to make it through that time and really to reseed what would become Jewish community and the Jewish future. Certainly one of the other darkest times in our history is the time of the Holocaust, the Shoah, and both Sheryl Reicher and Barbara Donick have family history that connects to the Holocaust, and thought I would ask them to join me and talk about their sense of their family story, how they see the ideal of perseverance in that story, and maybe also to spend a moment or two reflecting on the holiday of Hanukkah if we get to that. So Barbara, maybe we could start with you, and if you could just share with us a little bit about the story of your husband, Irv, of blessed memory.
Okay. Well, Irv was born in Poland, in a town called Radzywiłów. I think that was the name of it when he was born. And when the Germans came in, the Nazis came in, they killed all the older people. His grandparents were buried alive, I think, because his mother went back to see if she could find something, and she did in a grave later on. But my father-in-law was a very smart businessman, and he had saved some gold coins. So he went to a neighbor and asked if she would hide them under her thatched roof. And Irv was I guess he was about a few years old then. And so they hid under the thatched roof for 9 months. She took the gold coins and she gave them bread. They could only come down at night. But then she was getting afraid because she thought she was buying too much flour or whatever she was buying to make the bread. And she told them they would have to leave. And my father-in-law asked if they could just wait a few months because it was winter and they had no place to go. And she let them wait, and they hid in the woods for a few months until they found a place where my father-in-law's sister had a woman in another area who was agreeing to hide them. She made a place under the horses in the barn to hide them under there. She was a Christian woman who didn't take any money because she felt it was the Christian thing to do to save the lives. They hid they were 2 months in the wood, and they were in the hiding from September till March, from September 1943 to March 1944, until the Russians came in. At that time, they couldn't go out at all. My mother-in-law was the only one who could go out, because if the men went out, they could tell they were Jews, obviously, from the circumcision. So the women would go. My mother-in-law told me the story that once she went out to get something, and a German said to her, accused her of being Jewish, and she put her hands on her hips and said, "How dare you call me a Jew?" I mean, she was amazing. So that, if you want to call survival, perseverance or resilience, she had it. And after they came out of hiding, my father-in-law was amazing. He had money or something where he had bribed some Russian soldiers. He wore their uniforms. They escaped and got out of that area and went to Krakow, where they stayed for a while, and then realized with the Russians coming in and communism coming in, they couldn't stay there. And though they escaped from there, I think a few people died on the way to where they were going, and they ended up actually in a DP camp in Munich called Nye Freiman. And that's where they were for about a year or so. I don't remember how long. That was the first time that Irv went to school.
And Irv was how old, Barbara, at that time?
He was about, I guess he was about 8, because he was 10 when he came to the United States. So they lived in the DP camp, and then they got permission, my father-in-law, they got permission to come to the United States, which was a big deal. But they needed a marriage license. Of course, they didn't have any marriage license because they were in hiding all this time. And so the man, whoever was in charge, was very nice and told them they could go down to a justice of the peace, and this was in Munich, and get a marriage license, which they did. And so they ended up being able to come to the United States.
Sheryl, I'd love if you could tell us some things about the story of your family, and specifically your mom and dad.
Okay. My father lived in Warsaw, Poland with his brother, his parents, and an uncle in a small apartment. And my mother lived in a small town called Slumniki, which is just north of Krakow. She and her parents and 7 other siblings, there were 8 of them, lived behind a bakery that they owned. And the bakery, the back of the bakery was their home. And my father was in the Warsaw Uprising in the ghetto. He and his brother, his parents were taken from him off of the streets and shot. He and his brother were able to survive the ghetto together, living underground, virtually underground, in a sewer. And they would take turns every so often going out to get food. Eventually they were all found. My father was put in one line to go on one train, his brother on another. And my father never heard from my brother again.
That was that, yeah.
Yes, that was that.
Do you know how old was your father during that time?
He was in his 20s.
Okay.
Yeah, he was in his 20s. And my father was in Auschwitz, my Donick book involved. And he was liberated by the Russians. And the Russians told him to go to a DP camp that was run by the United States soldiers, which is what he did. My mother never talked about her story. The only thing I know is that she was in a concentration camp near Krakow called Płaszów, the concentration camp made famous by Schindler. She was not on Schindler's list. A cousin of hers was. And at the end of the movie, you do see my mother's cousin putting a stone down on Schindler's grave.
What a scene that is. It's a powerful scene. Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is.
And so your mom and dad met at the DP camp? Is that where?
Yes, they met at the DP camp. My father had no one left of his family. He happened to meet a young man who was my mother's friend from her old town of Slumniki. And my mother's friend said, "I've got a girl for you. Her family is going to the United States. come meet her, and a shidduch was made, and they were engaged in the DP camp. They were married in Frankfurt. And my father came over with my mother's remaining family, and her mother actually survived the war.
Wow.
And 3 other siblings. So they all came to the United States. Their first stop was Buffalo. And from Buffalo, they went to Camden, New Jersey. And that's where I grew up.
What year did your mom and dad come to the States? You know,
They came in 48.
in 48. And so it was
Yes.
a year and a half after the war ended or something like that.
Right, right.
So let me ask you, Sheryl, you know, it's interesting. You said you knew your dad's whole story, and I guess because he spoke about it.
Yes.
But your mom really, she didn't want to go there. What was your sense of the way between your mom and dad, they sort of navigated that? Was that something you think they talked about together, or it was just something that they had experienced and the experience was enough?
I think they did talk about it, but my mother would just never talk about her experience.
Yeah.
And as a child of Holocaust survivors, the way I felt about it, and I think that other survivors' children do as well, is that I wanted to protect my parents. They had already suffered enough.
Yeah. When you were talking about your dad in Warsaw, I was thinking about, we were there with the Bethel trip, not this past summer, but the summer before. And you do this walking tour in Warsaw. You know, everything that happened in terms of the Jewish resistance really was below ground, like you were saying, in many ways. And then the ghetto walls are all gone, but there are a couple of fragments of the ghetto walls that are still there. And you walk along where the old wall was, and there are points where it's marked, you know, on the ground, this was a bunker. And you know that underneath your feet is a bunker where Jewish resistance was, where Jews were hiding, like your dad and like your uncle. You know, and yet in the story of your family, there's incredible perseverance. The fact that after the experiences they had, your mom and dad found one another in a DP camp. And, you know, listen, when you get married, what are you actually saying? You're saying marriage is about the future. Marriage is about the life that you're going to create together. And they were, did you see in them perseverance? Did you ever think about them in that way when you were growing up?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. They were very resilient. My father worked very hard. My father was a furrier. He learned the trade in Poland prior to the war beginning. He was already working as a furrier. And he says that actually saved his life in the camps, because when he first got to Auschwitz, they were asking for a tailor. And he thought because he had the first skills, he raised his hand. He said he took his first risk. And what he did was he sewed blankets and gloves for the inmates and for the SS.
Right. And I guess if you had a skill, you had a better chance at survival. Yeah.
Right, right. And at home, I mean, my parents, you know, most everybody's story was they came to the United States without language and without money. They
Right.
came filled with hope, and they wanted to work and they wanted to create a new life. And that's just what they did.
That's what they did. And then look at the generations of the family, you know, it's always striking to me when, you know, I'm talking with a family that has a history of surviving the Holocaust. And, you know, here's this family in the United States, and it's a beautiful family. It's Jewish. It's a family that it can go to shul when it wants. It worships openly, and you know, these are all the things that the Nazis were hoping to destroy, and yet here we are. So Barbara, you know, knowing Irv like I did, and he was one of the sweetest guys. I mean, he was just warm and friendly, you know, and just a generous spirit, and just like a loving person. And did you ever sense from him any bitterness from the Holocaust experiences that he had? Did he ever talk about that, or?
No, he never talked about it. I actually was like a child to his parents because I knew them since I was 13 when I first met Irv. They never talked about it either. never. The first time I heard anything, and Irv heard anything, Irv really said he didn't remember.
Yeah.
And I think he was kind of in denial because he was old enough to have remembered some things.
Right.
But I remember when his father died and we were sitting Shiva, his mother and his aunt, his father's sister, started telling us stories. And that was the first time we'd heard anything about what happened to them.
It's such a common thing, Sheryl, like you were saying with your mother also, that you just kind of had to compartmentalize it, put it in the back, close the door. And that was the way you were going to be able to move forward. You know, that was one of the techniques that you used so that you could persevere and make a new life, in a sense. Do you see any connections with your family's stories and the holiday of Hanukkah, or any other holidays, but particularly the holiday of Hanukkah, since this is Hanukkah?
Well, you know, the miracle of the oil. You know, the miracle of the oil lasting 8 days. And, you know, for me, it was a miracle that my parents lasted years, and my mother's family.
The lighting of the candles is significant, and bringing light, you know, into life and continuing to grow and to live, and in spite of all of that.
Yes, no, exactly right. Also, Barbara, that, you know, Hanukkah falls on the 25th day of Kislev. That's the beginning of the holiday. And that always will be one of the longest and darkest nights of the year. Okay. One of the longest nights, because it's in the winter. So we have fewer daylight hours and more hours when it's dark. But one of the darkest nights, because since it's towards the end of the Hebrew month, that means the moon will be gone. There will be no moon. And clearly, to me, that's always been intentional, that when it's a long, dark night, that you begin as a human being to push back against that darkness, and you bring light into the world, you know.
I have an interesting story, speaking of light and candlelight.
Yeah.
When my mother's family had to be taken out of their house, my grandmother buried her candelabra that she lit every Shabbos night.
Okay.
And after the war, she went back to their home in Slomniki in Poland, and she dug up that candelabra.
Wow.
And I have that candelabra, and that's what I light every Shabbos night.
Oh my gosh. Wow. That's incredible. I mean, the symbolism.
It really is. Yes.
Yeah. That's it right there. It's a miracle, like Hanukkah, right?
Yes. Because I've had conversations with my children. I think it's so important for them to know where they come from. And whenever, you know, there's a problem or a weakness, I always remind them of the strength behind them, you know, of the strength in our blood, because I really believe that. And I want them to use that to help them, to get them through whatever problems they may come across.
Yeah, that's that perseverance again. It's the door by door. Yeah.
I was just going to add that Irv thought it was very important when our grandchildren were old enough. We took a group of them who were old enough. There were 5 grandchildren that we took with their parent, with just my daughter and son-in-law. And we went and toured Eastern Europe, and we took them to Auschwitz, and we took them to Krakow, and he showed them where he lived. And his history and what he did is very important in all of their lives. Every grandchild at their bar bat mitzvah talked about Irv and what he had done. So I think that's very important.
Yeah, Barbara, you know that, you know, at the celebration of Irv's life at his funeral service, that was a very clear message that came across from everyone who spoke, that sense of, you know, Irv being that kind of inspirational. And the thing was, he didn't think of himself that way, really. You know, he was such a humble guy. But in a way, like what Sheryl's saying, these are people who are normal people, like all of us, and yet we're asked to do things that we should never be asked to do, and yet they did it, and they figure that's what I have to do, and that also is a way of persevering. You know, it connects also in my mind to the story of the Jewish people. You know, it says often in the Torah that the Jewish people are, it says am kshe oref, means like stubborn, like stiff-necked. And commonly in the Torah, when that's mentioned, it's like it's kind of a negative thing. But the truth is, we wouldn't be Jews if we didn't have some of that stiff neck, some of that quality that enables us to face those dark times, like people in your family have faced, to persevere, to get through, to push back against the darkness, to find the miracles that we can find in the course of our lives, and God willing, to make a brighter and better future, not only for your families, but for the Jewish people. And that's a story of both of your families in a remarkable way, really in a remarkable way. Okay, well, I want to just thank Sheryl, Reicher, and Barbara Donick for joining me for this conversation on perseverance, about sharing such beautiful personal stories about their families on this night of Hanukkah. And we're going to wish everyone a Chag Orim Sameach, a happy Hanukkah. Barbara, you want to just say happy Hanukkah to everybody?
Chag Sameach, everybody.
Chag Sameach. Sheryl?
Chag Sameach, everybody.
Chag Sameach. We should just have a happy Hanukkah, and let's hope, God willing, for a bright and beautiful 2021.
Yes.
Thanks so much for joining tonight.
Bye.
כי שמך צורב את השפתיים, כי אם שיקה